Hey friends, it is Monday, April 11th. So glad you're with us on this first edition of Holy Week for our Bible study. We're going to finish up the Gospel of Matthew this week, and then we'll probably move into our summer break for a few months so that the pastor can read the Bible for himself for a little while. But I'm so glad you're with us today. So mindful of how important these days are and leading up to Good Friday and Easter, and I hope that whether you're around Trinity or you live somewhere else, you will fully participate in the worship experiences offered by our churches, because it's just really important. It will shape the way you experience Easter. I think the more we invest ourselves in worship and this story in the days leading up to Easter, the more powerful Easter becomes for us. That said, we got a big section of Matthew 26 to read through today, a lot of important moments, including sort of revisiting one that we talked about in the sermon yesterday. So I want to go ahead and get us started with a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Gracious and holy God, on this week especially, we are mindful, Lord, of how easily our faith crumbles beneath us, of how quickly we give in to impulses and desires that are not in line with your will for us. Lord, we're aware of our spiritual blindness, how easily we miss the signs of your kingdom all around us, the presence that you've so often promised. God, help us to be more sensitive to your nearness, to the power of this gospel story. Lord, help us to be found faithful even when we come into times of trial and struggle. Help us to live after the pattern of your Son with the hope that he has established for us. And now, Lord, in this time of silence, we're bold to name before you the people and the places that we are thinking about in our prayers today. Now, God, speak to us through these words on the page, through this familiar story, that we might slow ourselves down long enough to step into this story, to hear these words afresh, to picture these moments in our minds, and to follow your Son with all our hearts. For it is in his mighty and matchless name that we pray these things, and all God's people said, Amen. All right, y'all, so today we're going to read through Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 75. Over the last few days, Friday and Saturday, we had readings from the Gospel of Matthew through the end of chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, and then basically the beginning 35 verses of Matthew 26, the Last Supper, as Matthew captures it there. So today we're jumping into Matthew 26, verse 36, and it's set here in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is at the foot of the Mount of Olives. We've talked a little bit about that earlier as we talked through Palm Sunday and the events of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem. This mountain Mount Olivet, or the Mount of Olives, is right up against the city of Jerusalem, and this was believed to be a place where the Messiah would appear at the close of time. So a lot of people are buried on the Mount of Olives, and at the foot of the Mount of Olives is this garden. Gethsemane means oil press, like olive oil press. And these olive oil trees, or olive trees, not olive oil trees, but you know what I mean. These olive trees, there's at least one or two of them that are up to 2,000 years old. So they may have been there at the time of Jesus praying. When we imagine this scene, this is really important to understand. When we imagine this scene, we tend to imagine a very quiet, empty garden, Jesus by himself. In reality, in a Passover week, especially for the Mount of Olives, because it was so significant for the hope of the Jewish people and the return of the Messiah, and all of the themes that are really explicit in the Passover message. Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives was probably completely crowded with pilgrims. Like, people camped out to be near the city, to be able to worship in the temple. I think that really changes the way we imagine these scenes. It's probably why Judas is necessary, because he's got to help pick out Jesus among a bunch of people. So it's more helpful if you imagine like Woodstock or Bonnaroo. Maybe those are not the best images, but I'm trying to think of crowded outdoor things. So think less of like how, the Passion of Christ depicts this, and think about it more like just a mountainside covered with people, and Jesus and his disciples sort of finding their way. So the reason why Judas and is so important is they're trying to extract Jesus from this crowd without starting a riot, without sort of causing an uproar, and the riot has almost started anyway. So keep that in mind as we're going through these stories. Imagine a crowded mountainside when all these events happen. Verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, again, which means oil press. Said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death." And this resonates with like Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, just the heaviness of a soul. And this "even to death" phrase is really important because it signifies sort of the significance. It suggests how heavy and weary and weighted down Jesus is in this moment. Remain here and stay awake with me. Again, Jesus asked for them to stay awake, to remain in this place. But again, imagine sort of a crowded scene, Jesus trying to find a quiet place to pray, and his disciples there as well. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." What's interesting about this prayer that Jesus prays in Gethsemane, there's a number of fascinating things, but what's interesting about this prayer and sort of the unfolding events that happen around it and Jesus' dialogue with the disciples is it's going to really closely match the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, your will be done, not our will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Notice how many times Jesus' words here around this prayer, but also Jesus' words in the prayer, are going to match some of the patterns we see in the Lord's Prayer. He says, "Lead us not into temptation," or "Lead us not into the time of trial." He's going to say to the disciples, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." So just a lot of overlaps where the teaching of Jesus at the Lord's Prayer is going to be mirrored here in the way he prays in his hour of need. So clearly the Lord's Prayer is not just sort of a memorize these words. It's sort of the formula that Jesus even models for us as to how to pray. And this image of "let this cup pass from me," obviously Jesus is not talking about a literal cup, but in the Old Testament prophets, you get this, and in the Gospels you get this image of a cup being sort of the fate of a person, or the burden that a person has to bear. And so when Jesus is talking about this cup, it's this image of what he has to do, what he has to accomplish, what he has to walk through. If there's any way for this cup, for my burden, to be passed from me, let it be so. But not my will, but your will be done. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Not what I want, but what you want. Then he came to the disciples, found them sleeping. He said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus is highlighting here sort of this internal spiritual battle we are all wrestling with. We're in so many ways we are sort of torn between, like how Paul says, I know the good, I understand the good, and yet I do what's wrong. That we are sort of perpetually in this tug of war between what Jesus calls the spirit and the flesh. And again, we can caricature those things and make it we can oversimplify that battle. But I think what Jesus is talking about is that desire to do something greater than our own desire, that hunger to do something greater than our own short-sighted need. How do we see beyond our own wants, needs, desires to the greater things that God is calling us to? How do we have the courage to seek after those things? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This is sort of the spiritual battle we're all engaged in. Again, he went away for the second time and prayed, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Again, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. So again, we see Jesus not coming up with new things to say. He is praying for the strength for God's will to be done. I said this in the sermon yesterday. I think it's really important that this moment takes place in a garden, and it's highlighted in a garden. Again, the Gospel of John's even going to set the resurrection in a garden, because it's meant to evoke those images of the first garden, the perfect garden, and Adam and Eve and their failure to be faithful. And here Jesus in the garden is completely faithful, praying for the strength to do God's will, even when that is the most difficult thing that could possibly be asked of him. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Again, they've sort of slept through the whole show. They've slept through their moment, their moment to be faithful. And again, imagine a crowded scene, nighttime, people camping out to be near the holy city for Passover, and in the midst of sort of the crowd and people and probably campfires and things like that, here come Judas and this crowd of soldiers. The Gospels are a little bit sort of not divided, but they give different images of what this crowd looks like. John is pretty explicit. It's like a cohort of Roman soldiers, which is an overwhelming number of soldiers. No matter what, they emphasize sort of this large group of probably temple police coming along, led by Judas to the spot, so that Judas can signify to them who Jesus is. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, again, we know that, but Matthew wants to emphasize it, that this is one of the 12 apostles, one of the 12 disciples arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, The one I will kiss is the man, arrest him. Now, kissing is a sign not necessarily of love and friendship. It's a sign of respect and honoring. So it would have been a traditional sign of sort of paying homage to a teacher or to a rabbi. Remember earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has told us, don't call your teachers rabbis, presumably because that's what the rabbinic Jewish community is doing in the time of Matthew's community. And so Judas is the only one who calls Jesus rabbi. So Judas is going to sort of live out the things that Jesus has told the church not to do. At once he came up to Jesus and said, Greetings, Rabbi. Calls him Rabbi and kissed him. Sign of honor, sign of respect, but obviously there's sort of just a darkness to this. Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you are here to do. This is actually a question in the original Greek. We normally translate it as a statement, but Jesus does call him friend, which is so interesting. We could probably spend a long time talking about Jesus calling Judas friend. But the literal Greek is like, what have you come here to do? But most translators turn it into a statement. Do what you've come here to do. To sort of to emphasize Jesus knowing exactly what's happening. And he clearly does, because he says, look, my betrayer is at hand. It's just striking that Jesus also calls Judas friend. It's a really powerful moment to me. The Gospels are clear that Jesus washes Judas's feet. Jesus breaks bread and shares the cup with Judas. And here at the end, Jesus calls his betrayer friend. Do what you've come here to do, or what are you here to do? Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus. Now, John says this is Peter. The other Gospels are just emphasize that it could be one of these four that are with one of these four disciples. It could be like a larger crowd, again, that's gathered on this countryside that has come with Jesus. Somebody put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So this is the slave of Caiaphas, and his ear is cut off. And this is sort of a testing of what Jesus has said about loving your enemies, about nonviolence, about not returning hate for hate, anger for anger, violence for violence. And sure enough, Jesus is going to sort of model what he has taught, what he's instructed his disciples to do. Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." The same thing is said in Revelation, by the way, that all those who take up the sword are going to die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send to me more than 12 legions of angels? This idea of legions of angels, especially 12 legions of angels, which is sort of a complete, like a cohort of an angel army. This was really important in like the texts at Qumran, some of these apocalyptic Jewish visions of the end of time, that the Son of Man will have these armies of angels. Revelation depicts these sort of armies of angels. The idea here is that Jesus is not only showing restraint in not taking up earthly arms, but also Jesus has the ability, Matthew really wants to emphasize this, Jesus has the ability to bring all this to an end. And so Jesus is not just being taken, Jesus is restraining himself. Jesus is not using the power available to him. And the reason he's not doing that, and this is very important for the Gospels, but especially for the way Matthew is sort of framing this, it's verse 54. How then would the Scriptures be fulfilled? In other words, this is really important that the Scriptures be fulfilled, which is why Matthew has come back again and again to the Scriptures, which say it must happen in this way. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit?" This word is used in other Jewish histories, especially from Jesus' time, to imply sort of a revolutionary, like a terrorist. How we might use the word terrorist. So if you can imagine, in Jesus' time, again, we imagine sort of this docile Jesus praying alone in the garden by a babbling brook. The moon is really clear, and if that were the case, probably the soldiers would not need Judas. At the same time, we often lose sight of how politically tense Jesus' time was. There were assassins. There, like murders for hire, sometimes in the temple or out in the temple gates and the outer gates. There were a lot of political insurrectionists that attempted to overthrow the Roman government or overthrow the Jewish authorities. Matthew's writing after the Jewish rebellion that lasted, 6 or 7 years, and in the middle of it, the temple is destroyed. So this word that Jesus is using here was applied to all those political terrorists who were threatening the Roman government, but also threatening the Jewish authorities. So they are treating Jesus like he is a terrorist. I really think that's the most accurate modern word for us to understand sort of the way in which they are handling Jesus. Jesus continues, "Day after day, I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this is taking place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Again, that scriptures of the prophets being fulfilled is super, super important. And then all the disciples deserted him and fled. All of them left. Nobody stuck around. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now, this is an important detail here. The Gospel of John moves this up 24 hours so that the trial takes place before the Passover. Jesus' death occurs right before the Passover. In some ways, John's timeline makes a little bit more sense, even if it's more symbolic, because it's unusual that the Sanhedrin or the scribes and elders would gather in a house for a trial at the very time the Passover meal was supposed to be taking place, the night of the Passover meal. But again, that may be just they're violating their own rules, and that's what the gospel writers are trying to highlight. Matthew, Mark, and Luke really want to highlight the Jewish leaders' responsibility for the death of Jesus. John really plays up Pilate and the Romans' role in Jesus' death. He certainly does not let the Jewish leaders get off. But what I want to highlight in these coming chapters as we read is how much animosity, again, I've repeated this so many times, how much animosity there was between Matthew's Jewish Christian community and the rabbinic Jewish communities in the synagogues that were closely related. They're like the Hatfields and McCoys. And so the tension is greatest when, it's why Auburn and Alabama fans have so much animosity towards each other, is because we live and work together, right? Like, we don't really care about Oregon. Oregon's great. The uniforms are a little tacky, but we don't see Oregon fans regularly. I know some of you are out there, but you get my point. Like, it's folks that are closest to each other where there's the most animosity. And so a lot of this animosity that's going to be expressed against the Jewish people writ large is often taken out of context as we read the scriptures 2,000 years later. But back to this story. So this trial is going to take place at the home of Caiaphas. And Peter was following Jesus at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. So Peter goes into the courtyard. You can go today, you can go this next February, in fact, to the Holy Land and see Galicantu, this church that is built on top of what supposedly was the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. There's a courtyard over in this area with a statue of Peter. Galicantu means rooster. There's a rooster on the top of this steeple. This is the place of Peter's denial, but also of Jesus' imprisonment. These are the stone steps that are actually from the time of Jesus. These are probably the ways in which Jesus would have walked down the Kidron Valley to the garden, and these are probably the steps that the soldiers would have brought him up to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. And you can actually go into this dungeon or stall that is in the basement. And again, if it's not exactly the place, it can help you remember certainly the place in which Jesus was kept during his trial, where he could have overheard the accusations being made against him, sort of sat in the darkness listening to this going on. The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And this echoes with the passages in Isaiah, in Isaiah 52 and 53, and following the passages about the suffering servant who is silent like a sheep before its shearers. Jesus is modeling again these prophecies made about what the Christians came to understand were the Messiah. These passages from Isaiah especially that they came to see as prophetic about the person of Jesus as he was silent. And so Matthew is emphasizing the silence of Christ, the willingness of Christ as he goes through this. The high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. He uses power instead of the name of God, so he doesn't commit blasphemy. That's going to be an important detail. And coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has blasphemed. Again, because Jesus has used a word, a name for God, but he's not spoken the name of God, which is interesting. Why do we still need witnesses? Technically, you're required to have 2 witnesses to sentence anybody to death according to Jewish law. You've now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? They answered, he deserves death. And then the very same people who judge him began to spit in his face and strike him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you? Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before all of them, saying, I do not know what you are talking about. There's one time. When he went out to the porch, another servant girl. These are not people in power. These are not bodybuilders or Roman guards. These are servant girls. Saw him. She said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again he denied it, and this time with an oath. Do you remember how Jesus said, don't ever take an oath? And so one of the things that Matthew and Mark do is sandwich Jesus and Peter next to each other. We see Jesus silently standing before his accusers, spat upon, beaten, slapped, unjustly accused. And he's silent. He's faithful. Peter can't even admit that he knows Jesus, right, to servant girls. And so these 2 scenes are intentionally set up next to each other so that the early church, but also us, would have to ask ourselves, which path will we take? The path of Jesus, the path of Peter. Of course, this is not the last word for Peter, which is good news. But these 2 stories next to each other are really important. And so Peter swears with an oath. And again, one of the ways in which Christians were called to renounce their faith was to swear an oath, either of loyalty to the empire, or denouncing Christianity, denouncing Christ. And here we see Peter swearing an oath. I do not know the man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you're also one of them, for your accent betrays you. In other words, you are from the sticks, you are a redneck, you must be Galilean, and therefore you must be one of his followers. Then Peter began to curse. He swore another oath. Stop swearing the oaths, Peter. I do not know the man. At that moment the cock crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said earlier in this chapter, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Again, I talked about this yesterday in the sermon. I love the image at the end of the Gospel of John where Peter has the chance to claim Jesus and to name his love 3 times. I think that's much more for Peter's benefit than it ever is for Jesus's, but it's a chance for Peter to put the pieces back together. Peter's such a powerful story of sort of the ups and downs of discipleship, and we probably need a sermon series just on the life of Peter. That's coming at some point, maybe next year. We'll talk about it. Hey, if you don't have plans for lunch, join us at noon. Dr. Ed Hurley is preaching today. We've got 3 phenomenal preachers Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Really excited about hearing from these folks. We'll have a brief time of worship, $6 meal in the fellowship hall. That'll be lovely. Fellowship will be lovely. You can make it back into work in time. So if you're nearby, you don't have lunch plans yet, you got an hour and a half to get your act together. Get to the sanctuary at noon. Hear a good word. Hear some beautiful music. Share a meal with some friends. And start Holy Week right. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon us all and grant us peace. Amen and amen. I'll see you all at noon, or at ad board tonight, or tomorrow for Bible study.